increase the bandwidth. I hope that it's a little better than last week. And Be'ezrat Hashem, again, each week we'll get a little better as we learn the even more technical details.
Excuse me. Oh, is this Tarragon's class?
Yes, hi.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So looking forward to.
Excuse me. I don't see you, Shani.
I'll take care of that. Just hold on just a moment.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so wonderful as we began. And then last night, to truly feel the rains coming through, at least here in Gush Etzion. And today we're going to continue with the themes of Sefer Yehoshua. For those of you who have also participated in the Wednesday class, just to iterate that the Sunday class in Sefer Yehoshua is focusing more on Yehoshua as the leader, challenges of leadership. Some of we'll see even, the challenges not only of Yehoshua, both in the realm of...
Excuse me, the sound is not good.
Yeah.
Again, okay, I just gave a share right before. Yes, I do have earbuds.
Yeah.
Yes?
Go ahead.
Okay. Excellent.
No, not better.
Not better. Okay.
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 For now, just start teaching and if people can, and we'll see what we can do.
Okay. So what we're going to, I'm just going to try one more thing over here. And the output level. Okay. Okay. I say there. Okay, what we're going to be the challenges of leadership, both the prophetic realm and the of Yehoshua, albeit we're obviously going to speak about the perspective from as well, but we're going to settling, and therefore the pace is going to be a little different and the focus is going to be different. For after all, we'd be learning Sefer Yehoshua for 2 years. So instead, we're going to be learning it over the course of 1 year, but from 2 different perspectives. You'll certainly receive a sense of appreciation of Sefer Yehoshua from attending either the Sunday class or the Wednesday class, and definitely to receive both sides of the national, and I'm going to say the personal, definitely to attend both. But without further ado, we're going to continue with where we left off last week, which, if you recall, are the challenges of Yehoshua. We saw that when we open up Sefer Yehoshua, we have to remember that we've seen him and in various contexts beforehand. We saw him in the context of military warfare, our very first introduction to Yehoshua by Melchemet Amalek. And then we saw him by Ma'amad Har Sinai, the devoted student of Moshe Rabbeinu. And even when the rest of the peoples are worshiping the golden calf, Yehoshua is that steadfast disciple by Moshe Rabbeinu's side. The third time that we found Yehoshua was none other than being appointed one of the Anashim Tarim, the prestigious representatives of the people who are going to go and survey the land. And we know that it's Yehoshua together with Caleb ben Yefuneh who are going to come back with a positive report, and therefore their promise that they are going to be brought into the land of Israel, as opposed to their contemporaries. The next few times that we see Yehoshua is already within the context as successor to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's Moshe's initiative that is going to beget the selection of Yehoshua. For after all, it's Moshe who turns to God and says, you're going to leave this flock without a leader. And therefore, Moshe proposes, Asher Yetzei v'Asher Yavo. It should really be someone who has some military experience, sensitive to the fact that entering into the land of Israel is going to require military initiative. And therefore, throughout Sefer Dvarim, when we see Yehoshua, it in fact is not just going to be within the military context, but actually assuring the people and assuring Yehoshua that they're going to come and succeed in conquest. They will succeed in the conquest, and not just succeed in the conquest of the land, of conquering the land, but actually succeeding in perpetuating the words of the Torah. The last time that we saw Yehoshua, at the very end of Sefer Dvarim, Hashem is the one to command Moshe to bring Yehoshua to the Ohel Moed, the same place where Yehoshua initially received prophecy, the same place where Yehoshua then is going to perpetuate the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. And standing by Moshe, as Moshe sings his farewell song of Shirat Ha'azinu, of the future of Am Yisrael, including their iniquitous ways that are yet to come, including how they're going to come miraculously to the land of Israel. And therefore we saw even the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda in particular in the Gemara, who says that Yehoshua is actually the one to write that last 8 psukim in the Torah. In other words, Yehoshua continued this unique prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. So albeit last week we offered a rather, I would say, long introduction to understanding the works of Nebuah, the works of prophecy. These are timeless messages, and yet at the same time, when the Navi wrote them, he has a particular message to his generation. He understands both the timelessness of the challenges and the messages that he wants to deliver, but is also speaking to a people during that time who have some of their own anxieties. So without further ado, I'm both going to share, if you take a look at the chat, I'm going to share here in the chat the Mekorot for today so that everyone will have them. You have plenty of time to download them now. And at the same time for the future, I believe that Melissa will send everyone the Mekorot, but I'd like everyone to take a look at this in addition to, and I will be sharing the Mekorot as well. So we're going to take a look at Yehoshua, the end, or I should say really the beginnings of the first chapter and continuing through Yehoshua chapter 2. So let's take a look at this together as I'm about to share the screen. And we're going to continue with Sefer Yehoshua, prophetic and political leadership. One idea that we already mentioned at the very end of last week's shiur is the repetitive terminology employed of chazak ve'amatz. Let's take a look now at the very beginning of Sefer Yehoshua. And as you remember, in these shiurim, we're going to be focusing on Yehoshua as a leader in the realm of prophecy, leader in the realm of his serving as the political successor to Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophetic successor to Moshe Rabbeinu. And all this in mind, your homework, if you remember from last week, was to think about what potential anxieties are going through Yehoshua's mind. Well, the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, in fact, is going to answer or basically provide for the solution to that assignment. We began with the very first few psukim, and after the death of Moshe, who was called the Eved Hashem. So keep in mind that again, Chazal tell us that Yehoshua wrote down these prophecies. Now, once more, just to put this in perspective, that doesn't mean that as he's delivering these messages, he wrote it down. Rather, chances are, towards the end of his life, he looks back and he's going to write down selected prophecies, which means selected writings of messages of God that he was given from the time that he assumed leadership of Am Yisrael. So much so the Chazal tell us that his students could have also written down some of these prophecies. So Yehoshua, and we'll see how significant this is when we look at the ends of Sefer Yehoshua, which we're not going to do yet. But Yehoshua tells us Moshe is Eved Hashem, Vayom Hashem Yehoshua ben Nun misharet Moshe lemor. And this pasuk tells us a tremendous amount. We already saw the Ramban's commentary where Yehoshua is not just the son of Nun, but he is known as bin Nun. He is the son of Binah. He is referred to definitely as a very wise man. But even when he writes this first pasuk, he's telling us, I'm introducing you now to what happened after the death of Moshe, who was Eved Hashem. And when Hashem came to Yehoshua, you should know, this is Yehoshua describing himself as Misharet Moshe, meaning that Yehoshua sees himself as the Misharet, as the disciple, as the attendee of Moshe, but Moshe is the Eved Hashem. So can you imagine from Yehoshua's perspective, how is he going to step into these huge shoes of Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe is known as a servant of God. He is the attendee of Moshe, which helps us understand now the next pasuk. Yehoshua records that God came to him and said, Moshe avdi met. This is the reality. Moshe has died. Vata kum avor et hayarden hazeh, ata b'chol ha'am hazeh, ela aretz asher anochi noten lahem libnei Yisrael. Go and cross the Jordan. Enter already this land that I've given to Bnei Yisrael. Kol makom asher tidroch kaf raglachem, bo lachem nitativ. And this is another terminology that we're going to see repeated throughout Sefer Yehoshua, so much so that it seems that this is already going to help us appreciate truly the entire political, prophetic, and for this matter also, the historiographical message of Sefer Yehoshua. Hashem gave a promise. The promise was, any place that you place your foot, any place that you initiate coming to, lachem nitativ, I will give that place to you. Kasher dibarti el Moshe. See Sefer Dvarim. I told Moshe over and over again, just as I was with Am Yisrael in the past, just as I helped them in the wars against Sichon and Og, I'm going to be successful with you, with the future generation. And from all the different borders, and we're going to revisit these borders, because notice that God tells Yehoshua, you're going to go all the way from the Midbar in the south, all the way up to the Lebanon, to the areas of Lebanon, all the way ad Hanar Hagadol, Nahar Prat, all the way to the Euphrates in the ancient Mesopotamian area, basically all the way to the Persian Gulf, all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates, literally Mesopotamia. And sure enough, the Parshanim ask, is that really the promise? And the answer seems to be yes, but Ibn Ezra says not right away. Eventually, as you become fruitful and multiply, as there are more people to settle the land, that's when you'll make your way up to Nahar Prat. We know that this is not fulfilled until the time of Shlomo HaMelech. Kol Eretz HaChitim. You will make it, though, up to the lands where the Hittites live. Va'ad Hayam Hagadol Mevo HaShemesh Yeh Gevulchem. Through the areas all the way Mevo HaShemesh, and to the place we know where the sun sets, meaning all the way to the western sides. And so we have the north, the south, the east, and the west all taken care of. And keeping in mind that the focus is going to be, you will conquer all the way to the west, because right now they find themselves on the eastern side of the Jordan. So you're going to head straight across. Now in future shiurim, we're going to get very used to looking at maps. We're going to see numerous maps each week. We're going to try to understand and literally track the conquest of Yehoshua and Am Yisrael, trying to figure out some military strategy that we know establishes precedents for future wars. And I'm even going to argue modern wars in the land of Israel. But for now, we want to focus on the textual terminology, because that's what Yehoshua writes. He doesn't necessarily talk about any military strategy. He gives general borders that Hashem told him about. And now we really begin Pasuk Hey. And the reason I say really begin is because starting verse 5, we're going to hear the emphasis of God's words to Yehoshua. Now the words and the terminologies will repeat. Lo yityatzev ish lefanacha kol yemei chayecha. No one is going to stand, no man will stand before you all the days of your life, Yehoshua. Kasher hayiti Moshe eye imach. As I was with Moshe, I will be with you. Lo arpacha v'lo ezveka. I will not leave you. And therefore, I'd like to begin with you, understanding all of Yehoshua's, I would even say his resume that we discussed last week. What does he have to be afraid of? Well, as we see, the first pasuk told us all. Here we have Misharet Moshe trying to fill the shoes of an Eved Hashem. And this has so many different ramifications. Number one, will Hashem be with me? Yehoshua is wondering. Really, will Hashem help me out? Will Hashem make sure that miracles are performed in my day as they were during the time of Moshe Rabbeinu? But it's not just about the succession as political leader, but rather, he explains to him that, or we'll see right now, anxiety number two. And how is he going to be able to teach Torah like Moshe Rabbeinu? How is he going to be able to continue, as we know, the legacy of Torah Moshe, who received explanations, not just the words, but explanations of the Torah directly from God? How is he going to be able to continue to teach Bnei Yisrael Torah? How is the level of Torah scholarship going to continue? And in addition, we're going to see how Is a lifestyle of Torah going to continue? Can we remember that Moshe Rabbeinu was leading a people who basically had nothing else to do during the day? Moshe Rabbeinu had their full attention, as we know, for the last few months, wherein he was the one teaching them that are Vot Moab, by the plains of Moab, all of Mishneh Torah. Now they're going to be farmers. They're going to be warriors. How are they going to have time? How are they still going to live a life of Torah learning? And speaking of change in lifestyle, that's a major change in lifestyle from a Bedouin spiritual existence to a land-based agrarian and military existence. Let's even put Torah aside. How are they going to undergo that transition? It's a psychological transition, a practical transition. Yehoshua has to lead that transition. Is this going to work at all? How is he going to be able to maintain unity amongst the people? It was so simple in the Midbar. We were all basically living in quarantine. We were living around the Mishkan, everyone in their specific tents based on their tribes, each one with the degel. Now we're coming to a land, and I'll argue not necessarily a huge land, but definitely significantly larger than their encampment, surrounding a Mishkan. What's going to happen now with regard to these people from all over the country? How are they going to come to the Mishkan? How are they still going to feel some sense of a social unity dynamic? And how about even the basic day-to-day living? In the Midbar, they didn't have to worry about anything. Literally, the water was coming from the ground, and their food, their leaven was coming from heaven. Now their leaven is going to have to come from the ground with a lot of work, a lot of investment, and no guarantees. And their water is going to come from heaven, but only if they follow the mitzvot of Hashem. This is going to be a difficult transition as well. And who has to lead them through this transition? Yehoshua. And Yehoshua is wondering, is this really going to work? How am I going to do this? How am I going to maintain Torah learning in society and Torah scholarship, but at the same time enable them to undergo this transition as a religiously minded people? Certainly, and a huge, huge challenge that Hashem is going to address right now. As we already saw, number one, I will not leave you, Yehoshua. What does that mean? I won't leave you. Pasuk Vav, Chazak ve'ematz. Number one, here we find these first words of be strong and courageous. Really, don't worry about the military aspect. I'm telling you, I understand. That's an anxiety that you have, and you don't have to worry. You're going to be the proper medium, just as I promised this to Moshe and to the Avot. This is going to be the land. You're going to get this all. That was challenge number one. Pasuk Zayin, Rak chazak ve'amatz. Be strong and courageous with regard to the other anxiety. Lishmor lasot kachol haTorah asher tivcha Moshe avdi. All you have to do, you have it actually easier, Yehoshua. I don't even want you. Your job is not to teach new Torah. Your job is not to be mechadesh. You're not meant to be a revolutionary in Torah. That was Moshe. Your job is al tasur mimenu yaminu smol. Just like we find the relationship between Abraham and Yitzchak. Abraham is the revolutionary, and Yitzchak is going to be the means through which the changes, the monotheistic beliefs of Abraham Avinu are going to be perpetuated through the steadfast personality of Yitzchak. So too Yehoshua. Yehoshua, your generation number two from Moshe. Al tasor mimenu yaminu smol. No changes. Your challenge is not to be like Moshe, rather just continue what Moshe did. Now I know what you're wondering. How are you going to do this? How are the people going to maintain learning the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu if they have many other distractions? Pasuk Chet, verse 8. Lo yamu sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha. And this is where we're going to see such a remarkable revolution. This time, Yehoshua, you have to be the role model for the people. Do you remember by Moshe Rabbeinu, everyone saw Moshe as not only a class, but literally then a level onto his own. We just entered the words of the Torah. There's no one, lo yakum navi k'Moshe. You can't reach even the Moshe Rabbeinu's hems, and that's it. Moshe is in a class of his own, and certainly when it comes to teaching the Torah. Your job, Yehoshua, is not just to continue those Torot. Your job is lo yamu sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha. You, not everyone, you have to make sure to have the words of Torah on your lips at all times. while you go to war, while you deal with the political problems, while you deal with military threats, when you are going to be called upon to deal with economic crises, all the anxieties that you're talking about, just look at the words of the Torah, which is going to help us understand the precedent for all future Nevi'im. Nevi'im are literally the Gedolei Hador, to use a contemporary terminology. Nevi'im are the leaders of the generation when it comes to interpreting the word of the Torah. The Nevi'im become the ones who are most well-versed in the Torah. They're going to be the ones, even if they're involved in expeditions of war, even if they're involved in economic issues, they're going to keep the words of the Torah. They're going to continue to teach the Torah, learn the Torah, interpret the Torah. More important than learning it now, Yehoshua, is you learn it and make sure that it's properly taught and observed and kept by everyone. That's all you need to know. That's the means through which you're going to succeed in your ways. That's how you're going to gain the insight that you need. Just keep learning it. Keep learning it. Chazara, chazara. Review. Hello to v'ticha chazak v'yamatz. And now everyone notice this. This is the milah mancha. This is the leading word. Just be strong and courageous. Al tarot v'al techa. Do not cower. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. And this is just the proof text to Yehoshua's anxieties. Hashem knows exactly what we're all supposed to figure out, namely that Yehoshua is really nervous. He is afraid. He is terrified of all the above. God is with you. You don't have to worry about the economic changes. You don't have to worry about the lifestyle changes. You don't have to worry for now, again, about cultural issues. And don't worry, chazak ve'amatz. Now, what's so interesting about this terminology is that we'll begin with Rashi, who comments right here that the 3 times that Hashem uses this term of chazak ve'amatz are meant to, indeed, as we discussed, relate to 3 discrete components of Yehoshua's rule that will require special perseverance. Number 1, settling the people in the new lands, as we said, this, and I would even say the change in the culture coming into this new land, carefully observing the commandments of the Torah with all this. How are we going to, as we plant and as we go out to war, how are we going to continue with the words of the Torah? And so number 1, God said, chazak ve'amatz, you're going to settle. You don't have to worry. I promise you, everything's going to be fine in the realm of settling. Number 2, again, carefully observing the commandments of the Torah. This is not so easy. You have to stay connected to the words of the Torah. You have to continue to learn these words and you have to teach them to others. Carefully also, as we see number 3, engaging in warfare to conquer the Canaanim. That's going to be the 3rd. You don't have to worry about this either. Chazak ve'amatz. Now, what's interesting is that this is not the first time that we find the juxtaposition of these words, chazak ve'amatz, be strong and courageous. As a matter of fact, and they were told to us twice earlier, and not just told twice earlier, but told to Yehoshua twice earlier. One in the context of Dvarim, Perek Lamed Aleph Pasuk Zayin, when Moshe is standing with Yehoshua and Hashem, and Moshe tells Yehoshua, chazak ve'amatz, and the other time is God at the very end of this whole appointment and the song to Am Yisrael in Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph Pasuk Chav Gimel, also the same exact words, chazak ve'amatz. So notice that when at the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, if you're just opening Sefer Yehoshua, you definitely appreciate it as the motif of the beginning of Yehoshua, and you can definitely figure out the anxieties. However, now we appreciate that what God is saying to Yehoshua at the very beginning of Yehoshua is, come on, do you remember Moshe? Moshe already told you chazak ve'amatz, and I already told you chazak ve'amatz when Moshe was still alive. Those same promises, now that Moshe is dead, the same directive of chazak ve'amatz is here as well. Now, what we're going to hear it not only 3 times at the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, Perek Aleph, but the ends of Sefer Yehoshua, Perek Aleph. We're going to hear this as well in verse 18. That's when we're going to hear, and coming up very shortly, how the tribes of Israel, in response to Yehoshua serving as leader, his first directives as political and prophetic leader of Rabbanit Israel, they're also going to say chazak ve'amatz. So notice that we have this terminology employed by Yehoshua no less than 6 times. And what's remarkable is that Yehoshua hears it in Sefer Yehoshua 3 times from God and once from the people of Israel, which basically served to corroborate what he had heard from Hashem and Moshe Rabbeinu and Sefer Dvarim. So this is another way of continuing not only the legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu through Sefer Yehoshua, but also the promises that Hashem had given had given Yehoshua. Now, this is going to be extremely significant. I put this in parentheses just to get you excited about continuing to learn Nevi'im together, just as in order for us to appreciate the significance of specific terminology employed in Sefer Yehoshua, we have to go back to Chamisha Chomshei Torah, which we started doing last week in order to gain a little bit of insight into Yehoshua's personality. So too, in order to understand the unique employment of certain words throughout Nevi'im, we have to appreciate everything that came beforehand. In other words, there are going to be what I like to call textual cues or resonances of words that mean much more. For example, now that we know that Moshe and Hashem had already employed chazak ve'ematz in the context of Yehoshua's succession as leader, helps us appreciate that this is meant to continue. These words are here to substantiate his selection all the more. So too, when you continue to see these words later in Sefer Shoftim and Sefer Shmuel, in Malachim, appreciate that later prophets are building off of not only words of the Torah, but they're actually building off of words of earlier prophets. So for example, later in biblical history, the same phrase, chazak ve'ematz, is going to be employed by David to reassure his son Shlomo as he stands to assume the throne and to undertake the awesome task of building the temple. And Divrei Hayamim, we find the exact same words, chazak ve'ematz. But now that you understand them in Sefer Yehoshua, you appreciate that David is merely almost a pipeline or a vehicle of the words of Hashem to Yehoshua and saying, okay, just like Yehoshua was very overwhelmed after assuming the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu Shlomo, I know exactly how you're feeling. You're very overwhelmed after this remarkable kingship of David. Not to worry, chazak ve'ematz, and we should have chills as we hear it, because it's going to remind us, again, the sounds are going to resonate and help us understand, oh, now I understand Shlomo's anxieties a little more. And similarly, Chizkiyahu is going to use the same words to raise the spirits of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as the Syrians are going to be looming over the horizon and threatening to overwhelm their weakened state. And that's going to be Divrei Hayamim, where we see how Am Yisrael are also in a state of anxiety. Oh my, how are we going to do this? How are we, this lowly and weakened state of peoples who have been literally farmers, how are we going to fight against the very established Assyrian army? Chazak ve'ematz, don't worry. Just like Yehoshua, he had to transition from one state of reality to another. Don't worry, you can do it also. So this becomes key words based on Sefer Yehoshua. And now we're very excited. And once we have, okay, I'm just going to get back to, sorry about that, to our shared screen. Once we have Yehoshua being reassured, now we're going to revisit Yehoshua's first command. Right after chazak ve'ematz, we now hear about Yehoshua literally assuming the realm of leadership. So let's take a look and see, how does Yehoshua do this? Yehoshua is going to command the people. The very next pasuk, after chazak ve'ematz, verse 9, Al ta'arotz ve'al techad ki imcha Hashem Elokecha b'chol asher telech, be strong and courageous. What does Yehoshua then tell us? Guess what? Vayitzav Yehoshua. So once again, we're placing the emphasis on Yehoshua's persona. Now that he is invigorated as a leader, what is the first job as a leader Yehoshua has to command? And this is going to be very interesting, because you're going to see that what you're about to see as a command doesn't really seem command-like. When you hear this terminology, Vayitzav, we're used to literally Tzav et Moshe, Vayitzav Moshe, literally mitzvot. And that's exactly the point. Even the technical commandments that Yehoshua is about to command have the same veracity, the same mandates, the same directives as the commandments of the Torah. That's exactly what Hashem was saying. Go, get up now and act like Moshe. Get up and continue the messages of Moshe Rabbeinu. Act as a leader, Yehoshua. Come on, you can do that. And what does acting as a leader mean? Well, we already saw it could mean that he leads them out to war, but they're not in the land of Israel yet. But we're going to see that he has choices. He can deal with military preparation now. He can deal with spiritual pursuits. Let's look carefully as we look at what Yehoshua himself records as his very first command. Vayitzav Yehoshua et shotrei ha'am lemor, Ivru bekeref ha'machane, vitzavu et ha'am lemor, hachinu lachem tzeda, כי בעוד 3 ימים אתם עוברים את הירדן הזה, לבוא לרשת את הארץ אשר השם אלוקיכם נותן לכם לרשתה. And let's now take a look at this and we'll all be shocked together. Yehoshua commanded the officers of the people saying, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people. So firstly, Yehoshua is already giving a message. He's commanding the Shotrim. Who are these Shotrim? Who are these officers? Well, we already know about Shoftim and Shotrim Titein Lecha B'chol Sha'arecha. Moshe Rabbeinu had already in his time set aside officers of law and order that are going to be established in every community. And that was what was supposed to set the precedent for Am Yisrael to continue when they come into their different cities, their different communities. They're going to have Shoftim and Shotrim. Yehoshua then commands the officers of the people. If those that worked under Moshe Rabbeinu listened to Moshe, Yehoshua incorporates them as well and already recognizes he needs their support. We learned so much about political leadership from this. It's not enough to be a powerful and even a very talented Rosh Moitza, or to be a talented mayor or governor or even Rosh Memshala. And what one needs to do is first and foremost, work together with the Shoftim and the Shotrim. And we know this. Make sure that the commanding officers are working with you and through you. And what does he tell them to do? Ivru b'kerev hamachaneh. Go, each one of you, you know the people well. Go to the machaneh, vitzavu et ha'am limor. And basically make sure that you also repeat this as a command of Yehoshua. What's the command? Get your food ready. What an interesting command. I would even say maybe it's a suggestion. Why a command? Get your food ready. So on the most basic level, get your food ready, one can argue, wait, don't they have food? Don't they have the man? They're not supposed to ever prepare. As a matter of fact, that displays a lack of emunah. They're supposed to wait till the next morning and go and collect in the first few hours of the morning, because otherwise the sun is going to melt their food. So they can never prepare, especially for 3 days' time. And this is exactly Yehoshua's brilliance. He needs now to gather the people who are wondering what to do after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. So he knows that the next step is going to be to enter the land. But if he says, okay, everyone, get ready, we're going to enter the land, I can imagine there may be mayhem. And there are going to be some people who said, really? Like now? After the death of Moshe Rabbeinu? And really, Yehoshua, you know how many times we were told that we were going to enter the land? 40 years ago, we were told that we were going to enter the land. We had so many different opportunities of entering the land. By Yehoshua saying, prepare your food, what he is basically enabling the people to do is take control over their own anxieties. This is brilliant. He says, you prepare your provisions. What's going to happen as they prepare food? They're going to wonder, wait a second, why are we preparing food? Real food. Again, not this leaven from heaven. They're going to realize, wow, this time it's for real. We're actually going in. We're not going to have this man anymore, which also gives them 3 days, as we'll see in just a moment, to prepare for what Yehoshua was anxious about, this change in lifestyle. He enables the people to take control over their own anxiety and this transition, prepare food. It also is going to corroborate that they're really going to go in and prepare the food, prepare your provisions. But Yehoshua himself doesn't know. Are we going to have man for a day or two maybe when we come into Eretz Yisrael? Prepare. He's preparing them for becoming more independent. He's preparing them for this transition that he really still doesn't know how it's actually going to take place. God said, don't worry, it's going to work out fine. This is what it means to be a great leader. Without even knowing what God has in mind, Yehoshua initiates and he says, I'm going to help you undergo this transition. You're going to start preparing on your own. You're not always going to get the help from heaven. That's very overt. Now, you guys have to start preparing your food. Make a sandwich. Keep in mind, Am Yisrael have never made their own sandwiches. Again, the last sandwich they made was when they were in Mitzrayim, eating the Karban Pesach. And even then, it was just about the following the directives that were given by Moshe Rabbeinu. But maybe that's also the point. Just like Moshe's first command is a command of food. prepare the Karban Pesach. And there, if you remember, they had 14 days in which to do so. This time, Yehoshua says, you have 3 days. Prepare food. My leadership is beginning the same way as Moshe Rabbeinu's. And that's why, again, Rashi brilliantly says here on this pasuk that Yehoshua's directive to prepare provisions was stated. He says, how are you supposed to appreciate the juxtaposition between verse 9 and verse 10? Right after Vahi acharei mot Moshe vet Hashem, God came to him and said, come on, Yehoshua, you can do it. And then Yehoshua immediately, on the day that the 30-day mourning period over Moshe's death concluded, that's when Yehoshua turned to the people and said, okay, and we're moving on to the next stage. Come on. Do not get stuck in this rut of mourning and depression. We're going to move on. We're going to move to the next stage. And not only the next stage, he says 3 days. Wait, if he really wants to excite them, why does he say 3 days? Again, in 3 days' time, we're going to traverse the Yarden. Now, just time out for a minute. How does Yehoshua know that? How does he know, don't worry, in 3 days, we're going to cross the Yarden? And isn't that like up to God when we're going to cross? So on the most basic level, the answer is no. God said, I'm with you. You call the shots now. And we're going to see that even though Rashi and the Radak explain that actually, don't worry, God had told Yehoshua this. God had said in 3 days, we're going to cross the Yarden, and Yehoshua is merely responding. And why doesn't the text of Yehoshua tell us, God told Moshe, God told Yehoshua in 3 days, again, the people are going to cross the Yarden, is in order to help us appreciate that this time it's really Yehoshua initiating. Even if God is the one to give him the cue, Yehoshua initiates. And then we're going to see throughout Sefer Yehoshua, Yehoshua initiates and then God corroborates. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to substantiate everything that Yehoshua said. So Rashi says, don't worry, really Hashem said it first and then Yehoshua did it. But it's written as if Yehoshua did it first. And then Hashem comes to approve, which obviously is an even greater legitimization of Yehoshua's initiative, of Yehoshua's leadership. And that's what we need to hear about in Sefer Yehoshua. So notice this command, in which case we said is given in 3 days' time. Why does he say, prepare in 3 days' time, we're going to cross the Yarden? Why does he tell them prepare food for 3 days? I don't know how large their families were. And please remember that they don't have refrigeration. So they don't really need, or it's not going to be so helpful to prepare for 3 days. So why does Yehoshua choose 3 days? Well, let's take a look. We know that generally in Tanakh, we don't hear about the passing of time. And yet when we do, it generally is 3 days. I'm just going to give you a few of many, many, many examples. And you'll see why these few come to mind first. Vayhi bayom hashlishi, vayisa Abraham et einav, vayar v'hinei, vayar tamakom mirachok. On the 3rd day, it took Abraham 3 days from Be'er Sheva to get to Har HaMoriah. Now, and same idea over here. It doesn't really take 3 days to get from Be'er Sheva to Yerushalayim, and even on a donkey, right? Basically, you can make it there in a day and a half with plenty of rest stops along the way. And yet the Torah tells us that it took Abraham 3 days. So too, on the 3rd day, and we hear on the 3rd day was Paro's birthday. On the 3rd day, and after the dreams of the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfen that Yosef interpreted, there were 3 days, and then it was Paro's birthday. And we see the fulfillment of Yosef's interpretations that in the end serve, as we know, to catalyze his own exoneration from prison. We're also told before accepting the Torah, be prepared for the 3rd day. Moshe says you need 3 days of preparation before the revelation of Hashem at Har Sinai. And one of the other most famous, on the 3rd day, Esther says, Sumu alai. And I'm going to fast, but I need all the Jewish people to fast for 3 days. And only on the 3rd day is Esther ready to enter into the inner courtyard of the king. Other 3 days that I'm sure come to mind for you as well are the 3 days that Yonah was in the Dagah, Zena, either the male fish, the female fish, before he prayed. 3 days that it takes him to walk through the city of Nineveh. 3 days that Daniel asked to pray before Hashem before returning to Nebuchadnezzar's court. 3 days that it takes Yaakov to run away from Laban, and 3 days for Laban to catch up with him. 3 days that the people are supposed to watch their seh, watch their food literally for the Karma Pesach before slaughtering it, right? Paying attention once again to food. 3 days that they're supposed to have some type of spiritual worshiping of God in the Midbar before returning to Egypt. And 3 days later, when they don't return, takes Paro 3 days to catch up to them by Yam Suf at that point. So notice that we have 3 days quite often. What are 3 days? 3 days in all these cases are meant to tell us this is a time of deliberation. It's a time of mental and spiritual preparation. That's exactly what Yehoshua wants to tell them. Just like before Ma'amad Har Sinai, just like before Karban Pesach, every monumental event that has happened to you, you had 3 days of preparation. And therefore he's telling them, you're gonna have 3 days of preparation again. This is monumental. He's continuing the same duration of time that Moshe Rabbeinu gave before leaving Mitzrayim. Before Ma'amad Har Sinai, he says, I'm doing that too. Wait a second, what does that mean? He's repeating the 3 days before leaving Mitzrayim, before Ma'amad Har Sinai. Basically, leaving Mitzrayim was a fulfillment, as we know, of Brit Bein HaBitarim, of God's promise to Avram Avinu in Sefer Breshit, of Egeria Zaracha Ba'aretz Lo Lahem Va'Vadum V'Yinotam Rabba Me'ot Shana V'Charechen Yitzu B'Rechush Gadol. It was as we know, the fulfillment of God's promise of the people coming to a land. And they were supposed to go straight from Mitzrayim, basically, to the land of Israel. But first, they also had to fulfill the promise of the covenant of the people becoming a people through religious identity. That was Ma'amad Har Sinai. That was Brit Milah being fulfilled. Now, what we're going to see already at the very beginnings of Sefer Yehoshua is what Yehoshua knows. And that is when they come to the land of Israel, they're finally going to see the full fulfillment, both of Brit Bein HaBitarim and Brit Milah. They're now going to fulfill the Torah where they're supposed to, namely in the land of Israel. So if they had to prepare 3 days before beginning this process by leaving Mitzrayim, then they need 3 days now before actually completing it by entering the land of Israel. If they needed 3 days before Ma'amad Har Sinai, before their religious revelation, before their covenant with God, then they need 3 days before they actually see the fulfillment of that covenant in the land of Israel. What a beautiful idea that Yehoshua is teaching them. And he's telling them, so let's do it the same way. Prepare food. Just like before Ma'amad Har Sinai. Anyone remember, according to Pshat, what were they doing for those 3 days? The Ramban says they were doing a lot of laundry, right? They were told, Chibsu Simlotam. And yes, Seidah. And Shani Levine is asking, Seidah isn't just food, but supplies. And so what does that mean? What food would they be preparing if not man, which they couldn't prepare, right? It would melt. They can't leave man over to the next morning, which means that what are they doing? They're engaged in pragmatic activities. They're probably going out, and just as they traded for dyes, they're going to the various caravans around, and they're trading some of their flocks, some of their supplies, whatever it may be. They're trading them for food. They're literally preparing food that they're going to need. And sure enough, again, they need this time to prepare food. I see being asked as well because food, in fact, wasn't around, meaning food that could be prepared wasn't around. We're going to see then that it's a good thing that they prepared food. And what other supplies could this be? This could also be, just as we saw before, Ma'amad Har Sinai. And I can imagine, perhaps even doing, a couple of loads of laundry, that feeling both before we take a tiyul and after we take a tiyul. Again, time for laundry, right? Achinu lachem tzeidah. Prepare your supplies, but generally the focus is in fact going to be on the food. This is Yehoshua's first command, which seems so technical at first glance, but when you appreciate what leadership is all about, then you understand exactly how brilliant he is. He's playing off of, again, Moshe's directives, Moshe's commands before the people underwent a major transition to Brit Bein HaBitarim and Brit Milah, leaving Mitzrayim and entering into a covenant with God. Now, one last, apparently unnecessary expression of leadership we see starting verse 12. Let's take a look now at the third theme that we find at the opening of Sefer Yehoshua. Yehoshua calls, again, we hear Vilara Ruveni, Velagadi, Velachatzi Shevet HaManashe, Amar Yehoshua Lemor. In other words, Yehoshua called Reuven, Gad, and half of Shevet Menashe. For this purpose, let's take a look. He called them over and he said, Zachor et hadavar asher tiva etchem Moshe evet Hashem lemor. Hashem Elokechem meniach lachem v'natan lachem et haaretz hazot. Remember the thing that Moshe, God's servant, commanded you, saying, God, your Lord, will grant you and give you this land, referring to the land on the eastern side of the Jordan that was conquered by all of Am Yisrael in the war against Sichon, the king of Amori, and Og Melech HaBashan. He says, you remember, remember you asked about setting up cities for your flock and for your wives and your children. Yeshvu ba'aretz asher natan lachem Moshe be'ever hayarden. Keep your wives and your children and your cattle here. You don't have to schlep it across the Yarden. V'atem ta'avru chamushim lifnei achichem. And you're going to enter chamushim, which literally means you're going to enter armed before your brothers. Kol giborei hachayil va'azartem otam. And you're all supposed to say, we know this. We know this because in Sefer Bamidbar, and Moshe Rabbeinu had told Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe in chapter 32, he had said exactly the same. Moshe was so ballistic. When they asked for this land to stay in on the eastern side of the Jordan, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't believe this. I can't believe that you're willing to forfeit a nachala. I can't believe that you don't want to enter the land of Israel. I can't believe that you'd rather stay in this achuzah, in this transit area. And the people say, yes, but we're not forsaking the land of Israel. As a matter of fact, and we very much believe in the land of Israel. And Moshe says, well, if that's the case, then you're going to have to also show sacrifice for the land of Israel. You're going to actually lead your brothers. You're the militant people. So you're going to stand literally as the military buffers on the eastern side. And maybe that, in fact, we have no idea what was going to happen to these lands had Reuven and Gad not initiated by asking. You're going to be the buffer, the military buffer on the eastern side, but to show that the mainland of Eretz Yisrael is all the more important, you're going to go before your brothers and you're going to go wage war and you're going to show them because you are skilled militiamen. You're going to go and teach them literally, again, the art of warfare. You're going to go chalutzim lifnei Hashem. So why does Yehoshua, let's please remember that this was only a few months earlier when that whole narrative took place. Why does Yehoshua have to particularly call them and before they cross the Yarden and tell them this? So on one hand, one could argue that now that Moshe is dead, maybe they're thinking to themselves, okay, we made this promise before Moshe, so we're absolved of our duty. But we know that when they made this promise, Elazar HaKohen was there as well. They had to make this promise in front of Elazar. So there is a guarantor who is alive. He's the successor to Aaron, and he's here during this time. Once again, we have to put this in the context of the challenge of Yehoshua's succession as leader. Yehoshua doesn't just want to tell them, okay, I'm like Moshe, you gave your word to Moshe, you're going to give your word to me as well. Let's take a look. He says, Zachor et hadavar asher tiva etchem Moshe. Zachor. A word that we're so familiar with from Moshe Rabbeinu, from 6 times that Moshe used this term, Zachor. Remember the events of the past as if they're still happening now. Yehoshua uses the exact terminology. Remember what you said to Moshe a few months ago is still here today. Lemor Hashem Elokechem meniach lachem v'natan lachem et haaretz hazot. Now Yehoshua is going to provide them with the practical means through which they're going to fulfill the word that they gave to Moshe. In other words, you may have started this agreement with Moshe, but I'm going to be the executor. Not only am I going to remind you of what you need to do, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. This is how it's going to work. Your children, your wives, your cattle, they can stay here. You can stay on the eastern side. Can anyone tell me when else do we hear this word chamushim? Of course, if they're leading them in war, they're armed. They're not going to go out without their weaponry. The exact same word we hear describing Bnei Israel leaving Mitzrayim, leaving a foreign land to come ultimately to the land of Israel. Yehoshua wants to tell them, and you're now leaving the Iva Haryarden, that's like Mitzrayim, meaning it's foreign land, that you're coming chamushim. You're now going to fulfill that original destiny of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Kol Giborei HaChayil, you're part of this. You're part of the fulfillment of Brut Bein Habtarim. Va'azarta motam, you're going to help out the people of Israel as they conquer. Ad asher yaniach Hashem lechechem kachem. Until God, just as he gave you your land through military assistance, so too, until Hashem enables all of Am Yisrael to conquer and settle. And therefore, when we see the full fulfillment of Reuven, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh that Moshe added to these two tribes, when we see them gonna fulfill what they needed to do, and we're going to take a look and see how Yehoshua will phrase their fulfillment. V'shavtem le'eretz Yerushalayim. Only when I tell you that you did enough, then you go back to your land. V'yirishtem otah. And then you can go and settle it. Asher natan lachem Moshe evet Hashem be'ever ha'yarden mizrach hashemesh. On the eastern side of the Yarden. So now here's the question. Yehoshua told them how their promise, or what's known as their T'nai Kaful, their double condition to Moshe is going to work. Moshe, who is upset at their request, and finally, with God's approval, says, if you help the people go into the land of Israel and wage war against them, then you can inherit this land. If you don't, then not only do you not inherit this land, but you also lose whatever portion you would have been given in the land of Israel, and they agreed. Yehoshua, notice, doesn't tell them about the other side of their condition. He doesn't say, if you don't do this, then you're not going to get any land. He focuses on the positive. He says, this is what you said you would do. If you do it, you will get your land. You will conquer. As a matter of fact, keep your wives and cattle and property and children here because I have faith in you, right? Another sign of leadership. Yehoshua is encouraging them. But the reason why this little narrative is here is because it's really part of the two ideas that we mentioned before. It's still part of Yehoshua's initial state as leader. Not only can he then serve as a successor to Moshe, if you gave Moshe your word, then, again, I want to hear that word again. It's now Yehoshua saying, I'm going to tell you how you're going to fulfill the word to Moshe. I'm going to set in motion everything that Moshe had spoken about. I'm going to decide what the terms are. And we see then that this little vignette is going to serve as a paradigm for how Yehoshua is going to make sure that all the words of Moshe, that all the promises and all the details of conquest that Moshe omitted, how Yehoshua is going to teach us how it's going to get done. This, as we see then, is a conclusion to the theme of what we'll call the three sub-themes of the first unit of Yehoshua. Yehoshua as successor to Moshe. Because how beautifully does the story of Reuven and Gad end? Vayanu et Yehoshua lemor kol asher tzivitanu naaseh. Yehoshua, you're the one in charge now. You're the successor. Whatever you say, that's what we're going to do. Vet kol asher tishlachanu nelech. And of course, we are hereby representing Am Yisrael. That's what you just told us. We're going to represent the people as they go out to war. But we also want to tell you that we represent the people when it comes to accepting you as a successor, as leader. Here we find the fulfillment already of what Hashem had promised Yehoshua just a few verses earlier. Just as I was with Moshe, I'm going to be with you. Just as the people followed Moshe, they're going to follow you. And sure enough, just less than 15 verses later, we hear the people say, yep, we're going to listen to you. Just as we listened to Moshe, so too we're going to listen to you. As long as God is with you, as he was with Moshe, notice this, then we'll be with you also. And this is a brilliant inclusio format. What did God say? God said to Yehoshua, I'll be with you as I was with Moshe if you continue to teach and observe the words of the Torah. The people say, we'll be with you as we were with Moshe if you, and basically if God is with you, which God already said, I'm going to be with you if you're going to be with me. If you follow the words of the Torah, then I will help you. The people say, we'll help you, Yehoshua, also if you follow the words of the Torah, meaning if God is with you. And here we see then the idea of both Hashem saying chazak ve'ematz, and now the last words, what did they say? Kol ish asher yamre et picha v'lo yishmat dvarecha. The same words, kol ish asher yamre et picha. What did Hashem tell Yehoshua? Al tasor mimenu yaminu smol, leman taskil b'chol asher telech. Only if you listen to the words of the Torah, as tatzliach et rachacha. They say to Yehoshua, so anyone who doesn't listen to your words, which basically are the words of the Torah, v'lo yishma et dvarecha, l'chol asher titzavenu, all your mitzvot, Yehoshua, yumat rak chazak ve'ematz. Chazak ve'ematz. We will be with you if Hashem is with you. Hashem will be with you if you, in fact, perpetuate the commandments of the Torah. What a beautiful, beautiful conclusion for the chapter. So now, if you think about it, the 5 different anxieties with which we began are really just one. The people say, we will be with you, and if we know that Hashem is with you. And Hashem said, I will be with you if you're consistent with the words of the Torah. So now the question is, how are the people going to know if Hashem is really with Yehoshua? Yehoshua following the words of the Torah, that's between him and God. So there still is really one challenge that remains. The people need to know that Hashem is with Yehoshua. We, the readers, know that Hashem is with Yehoshua because of Perek Aleph verses 1 through 9. And that's why Yehoshua writes these things. He says, you see, Hashem is with me, so that in a few verses, when you hear that the people say, we'll be with you if God is with you, I just want you to know God is with me. But as we said, that's the message for us. The people in Yehoshua's generation are going to need some proof that God is with Yehoshua. And that's why we're going to continue with the next chapter. Before we do, let's just see how Chazal are so sensitive to what we've been discussing, namely the tension and anxieties of transition of leadership, from the prophetic and political leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu to that of Yehoshua. Rashi, on the very second pasuk, where we hear Hashem saying, and Moshe avdi met v'ata kum avora tayardein hazeh ata v'chol ha'am hazeh la'aretz asher anochi noten lahem lebnei Yisrael. Chazal ask, why did God have to tell Yehoshua, Moshe avdi met? Moshe died, now get up and go cross the Yarden. And to which Yehoshua, as we know, said 3 days. I know that we need these 3 days of mental preparation, spiritual preparation, and deliberation. So Chazal answer, Hashem said, Moshe avdi met, even though Yehoshua knows that Moshe died, to teach us that during the period of mourning over Moshe's death, there was a major transition. 3,000 halachot that had been communicated by Moshe were forgotten by the people in 30 days. Imagine this, 3,000 halachot. And in fact, Yehoshua already saw them with the death of Moshe, was a waning of prophetic leadership. And he turned to God and he said, how am I going to ever restore 3,000 halachot? And God responded, Moshe avdi met. Moshe has died. And those Torot of Moshe will not be restored. To tell you, Yehoshua, is impossible. Rather, you go and occupy the people with warfare. And this is a quote of Rashi from the Sechet Tmura, Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph. When Yehoshua is unable to restore the lost traditions, he inquires of God. And then what happens? The Midrash actually says the people of Israel threatened to kill him and say, come on, Yehoshua, you're the successor. Bring us back these 3,000 halachot. We forgot these 3,000 laws of Moshe Rabbeinu. And God says, no, they're lost. They're lost. In other words, Yehoshua is not going to be exactly like Moshe. Sorry, Torah to Moshe. There's some of it that you're not going to get back. And you can't think. The whole point is, don't think that Yehoshua is exactly like Moshe. He's not. And he's not supposed to, because right now the challenge is not going to be to sit for another 30 days or 40 days and 40 nights and try to restore 3,000 halachot. The challenges of this generation are going to be get up and fight the wars of Am Yisrael. And at the same time, Hashem says, you can't forget all of the Torah. Again, whatever Torah you remember, continue to perpetuate Yehoshua. Don't lose any more, okay? But for now, appreciate that different times require different religious imperatives. And right now, I don't want you to spend your time trying to get back. I don't want you to spend your time trying to be Moshe Rabbeinu. Don't spend your time and your energies, Yehoshua, to get back to the prophetic level of Moshe, because I hate to tell you this, you're never going to get there. Instead, be Yehoshua ben Nun. Go out and remember that emunah. Remember your valiant fighting against Amalek. I want to see that again. That's going to be what your prophetic and political leadership is going to be. That's the mark that only Yehoshua ben Nun can leave in this world. And we're going to continue to speak about the significance then of Yehoshua as a leader, and particularly his initiatives. So let's begin together now with Perek Bet. Vayishlach Yehoshua ben Nun min hashitim shnayim anashim meraglim. And the truth is, we don't know exactly when Yehoshua sent them out. Two different possibilities. He sent them out maybe even during the 30 days of mourning over Moshe. One possibility. As you'll see, you may like some of the chronological issues that possibility resolves, or that within the 3 days that the people are preparing their supplies and their food, Yehoshua says, okay, now I'm sending spies over to the city of Yericho, Shnayim Anashim Raglim, 2, as we're going to see in just a moment, military spies, Cheresh, which literally means in silence, secretly, Lemor, L'chu ru'u et haaretz vet Yericho, vayachu vayavo beit isha zona ushma racha vayishkevu shama. And the first question that you all have to ask is, really, Yehoshua? I don't believe this. You're sending Shnayim Anashim Meraglim. We know that terminology from just a few parshiot earlier. In Dvarim, Perek Gimel, Moshe recounted the story of what he calls then Meraglim, even though in Parshat Shlach, as you know, they're known not as Meraglim, not as spies, but rather as Anashim Tarim, and as tourists. And wait a second, that story ended horribly. It ended with a majority of these spies, 10 out of 12 of the representative tribes slandered the land, spoke negatively about the land itself, and primarily spoke about their inability, definitely their lack of faith in God, to go and of Hebron in the southern areas of Israel. So wait a second. Now Yehoshua is going to revisit that. He's taking a chance, number one, that maybe these spies are going to come back and they're putting that aside. In fact, this is to a certain degree, one of the failures, and so to speak, during the time of Moshe's leadership, and he's going to fix it. And he's going to be able to fix it with confidence. And I love how Melissa said the word Cheresh means Am Yisrael didn't know either, or just a secret from Yericho. How did you know? The question that we're going to ask. That's exactly, again, the question that we don't know. He sent it secretly. Does this mean it's a secret mission, as we're going to see in just a moment? Is this a secret mission of avoiding detection by the people of Yericho? Or is it a secret mission and avoiding detection by the people of Israel? Who is this secret from? So before we get there, let's take a look at the Malbim, who says, don't you see that this is a tikkun? Yehoshua, and this is brilliant leadership, is basically, again, going to say, I'm going to send Meraglim, but I'm going to do it differently, and we're going to do it right. And this way, it will only further bolster the people's support of Yehoshua, right? He fixed the problem, right? The crisis of the past. Let's take a look at some of the differences, though, that will assure its success. We begin with the Malbim's first difference. Whose initiative was it? We turn to Parshat Shlach, Shlach Lecha Nashim. Rashi there says, wait a second, based on Devarim, it seems that the people asked for representatives. But based on Bamidbar, it seems that God says, send the people. So who initiated? Was it God or the people? Rashi says, and really, God did not want to command them to send them, because I already told you the land is good. You don't need any pilot trip. I told you the land is good. right? I think as I look around, I see many olim, and I wonder how many of you had pilot trips. And before you came to Israel, right? You wanted to make sure that, okay, that Beit Shemesh was a good area, Modi'in, Renana, and some of you just said, I don't care, and I'm just going to come. I know the land is good. My sister lives there. She said that everything is okay. Okay, we have excellent. I see some pilot trips. Yes, okay, a lot of pilot trips. Yafeh ma'od. Again, I'm sure there are those that did not have a pilot trip. So Hashem actually says, I don't think you need a pilot trip. And I already told you the land is good. You should have believed me. But what can I do? The people, according to Rashi, the people wanted to send spies, wanted to send representatives for a pilot trip. So Hashem says, okay, and I'll go ahead with your initiative. According to this, and the people are the ones who initiated. So they saw the tribes. So the tribes saw the Meraglim, they saw these people as their representatives, which means that these 12 people saw themselves as, same idea, as representing Am Yisrael. So their first allegiance is not to Moshe and not to God, but to the people of Israel. Versus this time, Yehoshua sends the spies of his own initiative. Either the people don't even know about it, or that again, they know about it, but he makes it very clear. Vayishlach Yehoshua, not shlach lecha anashim. Vayishlach Yehoshua. And this way, these two spies know, they report back to Yehoshua. They have to find favor in Yehoshua's eyes. Yehoshua sends them of his initiative. Okay, from where were the spies sent? Difference number 2. Moshe sent the spies from the desert of Paran, far away from the land of Israel. The people hadn't seen the land. Again, that's the huge unknown. And therefore, when the spies come back, they're basically reporting really what they had seen. Everything is going to be secondhand. Am Yisrael have no idea. Versus, and I think that this is such a significant difference, in Yehoshua's time, please remember that the people are on Arvot Moav. Again, for at least, as we know, Moshe Rabbeinu gives them an entire mitzvah speech from Rosh Chodesh Shvat through Zayin Adar, but they were there even beforehand. So they were there for months. And I always love when we go on to Ulim in Eretz Yisrael, and soon, hopefully, to go back to this, and we go throughout. You can go anywhere on the eastern side of Eretz Yisrael. You can be traveling Kvish Yishim, and wherever you are on a clear day, you see right across, you see Ta'arvot Moab, or you go to Mitzpeh Yericho, and you see, it really looks like a hand's distance away. You're in the hills of Moab. Or my favorite part is literally going to the area of the Yarden, to Kasar al Yehud, and you see when you're on the Israeli side, and there are Israeli soldiers literally a few meters across from you, are Jordanian soldiers. And I said, can you imagine? And look how close we are to the eastern side of the banks of the Jordan River. That's where Am Yisrael are. I just want everyone to realize wherever we are, let's say on the western side, all the way through what we call Arvot Yericho, the areas leading all the way down to En-Gedi Yam HaMelach. Again, all those areas, there's a parallel topographical plane of Arvot Moab, right? Directly across from Yericho. We're in Arvot Yericho, and Am Yisrael in Arvot Moab, which on one hand just aggravates the frustration, I'm sure, and the depression that Moshe Rabbeinu was feeling. He's so close and yet so far as he can't enter the land of Israel. But I always say, we're so lucky that we get to look into Jordan. We get to look into the hills of Moab and say, oh, everyone look at the hills of Moab. Whereas Am Yisrael, again, for months beforehand, we're in the hills of Moab, and they're saying, wow, look at those hills of Yericho. Look at the land of Israel. Now the people see Eretz Yisrael from up close. And I want you to try to picture, for those of you who have gone to Petra, or for those of you who in general have seen, or just imagine, right, what the landscape looks like, the panorama. And from Jordan to the land of Israel, what do you see? We know that Yericho is going to be called in Sefer Yehoshua, Yer Hatmarim. See gorgeous palm trees. You see a beautiful landscape of mountains, and which means that you know that there's going to be rainfall. And you see some of the most beautiful, lush valleys. And you can imagine the people, and all they already feel is Haaretz Tovahi Ma'od Ma'od. And more than that, when you're so close, you feel the anticipation. You just want to be there already. You can even tell me that we're going to be sleeping in tents for 7 years. That's okay. That's okay. Again, I just want to get there already. And even if it means harsh conditions, and that's going to be a major difference between the spies that Moshe sends geographically and Yehoshua's. How about the purpose? So as we know, the Parshanim debate, why did Moshe even send spies? It seems in Parshat Shlach, when they're called Anashim Tarim, we know the word tar, and the Malbim, who is very philologically sensitive, explains tar, latur, means literally to tour, to go and see what's so special about the land. It was meant to be an exciting trip for the people. Versus by Devarim, they're called Meraglim, military spies. So what's the difference? A tar seeks to determine how good something is, whether a land is good and its mighty, its people mighty and the like. Meragel seeks out the weak points of a land, the place where it can easily be conquered. And that's exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu, again, is saying. They should have gone in as Anashim Tarim. They should have been focusing on the good, but instead they were focusing on the weak points. And then they basically, like any good, psychological perspective of, again, literally reflecting and then seeing themselves, they looked for the weak points and then imprinted them on themselves. Whereas Yehoshua says right away, you're going in as Meraglim. I want you to see the weak points, but the weak points, of Yericho, I'm giving you a very focused military mission. Rab Meidan explains beautifully that really what Moshe was trying to do was to combine both. Transform a pilot trip also into a military mission, but at that point, the goal becomes so ambiguous and unclear that the people misconstrued and looking at the good and instead only saw the bad, only saw the weak. How about the number? The number is also significant. Yehoshua only sends 2, reminiscent of the 2 who came back with a positive report, namely Yehoshua and Caleb. Like two can come back okay. Once you have 12 representing the tribes, and then not only do the people see these representatives as emissaries of the people and not of the leader, but also, again, 12 is just too many, too much negative peer pressure that could be there. And therefore, not only does he send out 2, but Chazal can serve the personalities and say which 2 did he send? Well, definitely Caleb, even though Caleb himself is going to say in a few chapters that he's over 80 years old. Chazal want to tell us Yehoshua chose people that he knew that already had a positive history for standing up for belief in God despite threats around them. And who was the second one? Chazal say Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, not only a descendant of Aaron, but Pinchas, the vigilante, the one who stands alone, the one who cannot tolerate Chilul Hashem, cannot tolerate Zimri and Cosby, literally desecrating the name of God. And lastly, how about the manner in which the spies were sent? Yehoshua sends his spies secretly, whereas there was a lot of publicity around the spies sent from the desert, a whole public appointment, and then Moshe publicly sends them out so that when the desert spies returned after 40 days, the entire nation was waiting for their report, and we already said they see them as their own delegates, and that led to the great public showdown between the 10 spies on one side and Yehoshua and Caleb on the other side. Even had Yehoshua's 2 spies that he sent come back with a frightening report, they would report directly to Yehoshua. He would then, because it's secret, no one else really knows about this, he would then be able to deal with it without it becoming a national issue. So as I see our time is up, we're going to return to what Melissa had brought up already. Okay, when it says Cheresh, exactly what does this mean? Who is the secret from? How does this affect their entire mission and the goal of the mission? So let's take a look and see some of the, again, I just want to end with some of your chats. And beautiful, Atara is bringing up the 3 days. Could it be back to creation? That on Yom HaShlishi it was Vayar Elokim Kitov Me'od, again, and Kitov, again mentioned twice. It was, again, Pa'amayim Kitov. God says twice Kitov. So that's a beautiful idea. Again, of 3 days, there's something special about 3 days. It's even more than a double good. It's that 3 days basically ends a unit. The first 3 days, God created the vacuum of creation, and the following 3 days, God fills those vacuums respectively. So 3 days ends up being a core amount of time that we see is really time for development, time for mental deliberation. So yes, I'm sorry about, oh, now I see all these, that's yes, all these requests for a break. So I'm just going to end with Robin's comment. And if Moshe sent the spies into Israel to spy out the land, where did Yehoshua send the spies? That's exactly it. He focuses on Yericho. So not to worry, because next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, I'm going to provide a map. Again, every week from now on, you're going to have a map that Melissa's going to send out. So you're going to have an entire collection of all different maps, topographical maps. Some of them are really going to look like military strategic maps. So we're going to get used to this. And when we take a look again at this idea,